The atmosphere in the restaurant was calm, almost serene, with the soft hum of conversations and clinking silverware filling the air. But all of that was about to change in an instant. As the waiter approached the table with a friendly smile, there was no way he could have known what was about to unfold. He had done his job hundreds of times before, always with respect, always with professionalism. Little did he know today, he would become the center of a confrontation that would leave everyone stunned. At the table sat a woman, her posture rigid, her face twisted into a look of judgment. She had the air of someone who believed she was entitled to more than just a good meal, someone who expected to be treated differently, above others. Her eyes narrowed as she watched the waiter approach, a hint of distaste creeping onto her features. It wasn't the first time she had made a scene in a public place, but something about the way she looked at him today felt different, more hostile, more deliberate. The waiter, unaware of the storm brewing, set the menu in front of her with his usual polite greeting. But as he began to speak, her words came like a slap, cutting through the air. Her voice was sharp, accusatory, as she made a comment that was as jarring as it was cruel. Her words, laced with racism, echoed in the otherwise peaceful space. It wasn't just the tone, it was the blatant disrespect, the sense of superiority that she projected with every word. The moment hung in the air, thick with tension. The other diners began to murmur, sensing the rising conflict, but no one knew how it would resolve. The waiter stood frozen for a second, his professionalism battling against the sting of her words. His hands were steady, but his mind was racing. He had dealt with difficult customers before, but this felt different. This wasn't just about bad service or a minor misunderstanding. This was about something far more personal. The woman didn't seem to notice, or maybe she didn't care. She continued with her rant, throwing insults with the belief that she was somehow untouchable above reproach. But what she didn't know was that this time, her cruelty was going to backfire. The waiter, calm yet unyielding, knew this was his moment. With a deep breath, he responded, his voice unwavering but firm. What happened next? It was a turning point, one that neither of them expected. The woman's smirk faded. The smugness that had defined her demeanor vanished, replaced by a growing realization that she had crossed a line she couldn't uncross. How would this confrontation end? Would she apologize, or would her arrogance make the situation worse? Could the waiter walk away with his dignity intact, or would he be forced to stand his ground in a way no one saw coming? The tension was palpable, and with every passing second, it became clear that this wasn't going to be a typical customer service exchange. As the standoff continued, the restaurant seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next move. The woman's face began to shift, her confidence wavering as she realized the power dynamics were shifting in a way she couldn't control. But the real question remained: what would happen when her world, built on entitlement and prejudice, came crashing down? To find out how this confrontation unfolded and what happened when she realized the consequences of her actions, stay tuned for the next part of this story. You won't want to miss how the waiter turned the tables and left the woman with more than just a lesson in humility. The air in the restaurant grew thick with discomfort. The hum of conversation had quieted to a near silence, as though the world had paused to witness what was unfolding between the woman and the waiter. Everyone knew something was off. It was like watching a train wreck in slow motion. You could sense it coming, but no one was sure how it would end. The waiter stood tall, his uniform neat and pressed, a sharp contrast to the simmering tension in the air. His expression remained calm, his gaze steady, though inside, his heart raced. He had encountered difficult customers before. He had been the target of rude comments, impatient gestures, and unreasonable demands. But this was something different. There was an ugliness in the woman's words that cut deeper than he could have prepared for. It wasn't just a matter of poor manners, it was a direct assault on his dignity. As the woman continued, her words seemed to grow more venomous, each sentence a calculated attempt to belittle him further. She didn't seem to care about the consequences of her actions, her privilege blinding her to the fact that she wasn't as untouchable as she thought. There was an arrogance in her posture, her tone, a belief that she could say whatever she wanted and walk away without consequence. Her voice was loud, cutting through the otherwise hushed restaurant. "I don't know why they even hire people like you. It's embarrassing to be served by someone who clearly doesn't belong here," she sneered, not even trying to disguise the hate in her words. The waiter's breath caught for a moment. He had always prided himself on being professional, never letting personal feelings interfere with his job. But this was different. This wasn't just about a bad customer, it was a direct attack. The woman was making it clear that her prejudice wasn't just about this moment. It was about something deeper, something systemic, that had built up over years. It wasn't just about service, it was about the way she saw the world, and the people in it. He forced himself to take a deep breath, focusing on the steady rhythm of his heart. He had dealt with enough difficult customers in the past to know that he couldn't let her words affect him, even though they cut to the core. His fingers tightened around the edge of the tray he was holding, but he didn't let go. He wouldn't let her see any sign of weakness. The other diners at nearby tables had grown quiet, their eyes darting between the woman and the waiter. Some of them were clearly uncomfortable, unsure of how to react. They wanted to speak up, to say something, but no one dared. After all, who were they to get involved? They weren't the ones being attacked. But they couldn't ignore what was happening either. The woman's words were loud enough for everyone to hear, and her attitude was unmistakable. It was a moment everyone in the room could feel, but no one seemed to know how to respond. The waiter's mind raced as he took in the woman's words, her scornful gaze, the way she leaned back in her chair as if she had already won. There were a million things he could have said, 1,000 ways he could have fired back, but something held him back. Maybe it was the realization that no amount of words could change her. Maybe it was because, deep down, he knew that the problem wasn't her, she was just the face of something much larger. His eyes flicked to the other diners, silently hoping one of them would speak up, but no one moved. Some of them looked away, others pretended to be absorbed in their meals, avoiding eye contact as if they were afraid to get caught in the crossfire. The only person who hadn't backed down was the woman. She kept her gaze fixed on him, expecting him to back off, to apologize, to submit. But the waiter wasn't going to back down. Not this time. Still, he didn't immediately respond. He could feel the weight of the moment. What he did next would define not just the outcome of this situation, but his own sense of integrity. The choice hung in the air, and he knew that however he handled it would matter. He wasn't just standing up for himself, he was standing up for everyone who had ever been made to feel small, invisible, or less than. The woman, sensing his hesitation, pushed further. "What, nothing to say? I guess you're used to being silent, huh? Just keep your head down and do what you're told. Isn't that the way it works for people like you?" Her voice dripped with disdain, each word calculated to cut as deeply as possible. Her words hit him like a punch to the gut, but he refused to let her see the effect it had on him. He took another deep breath, feeling the air fill his lungs. He wasn't just going to walk away from this. Not now. Not ever. Instead of speaking, he simply met her gaze. His eyes were steady, unwavering. He didn't need to say anything. His silence, his calmness in the face of her anger, said more than any words ever could. He wasn't intimidated. He wasn't afraid. And he wasn't going to let her turn this into something she could walk away from without consequences. The woman's confidence faltered. She was used to people crumbling, apologizing, and backing off when she launched into her tirades. She was used to getting what she wanted without question, without challenge. But something about this moment, about this waiter, made her uneasy. She was no longer in control. And it terrified her. For a second, the silence stretched out between them, thick and uncomfortable. The other diners were still watching, some shifting in their seats, others trying to avoid the confrontation. But they were all witnesses now. They had seen what the woman had said, and they were waiting to see what the waiter would do. Would he fold? Would he apologize? Or would he stand his ground? The waiter remained calm, his silence still speaking louder than anything he could have said. His thoughts were a whirlwind of emotions: hurt, frustration, confusion, but none of that showed on his face. He had learned long ago that in moments like this, staying composed was his greatest weapon. If he let her words dictate his response, he would lose. But if he stayed steady, stayed strong, he could maintain his dignity and perhaps even show her that there were consequences to her words. The woman, now visibly flustered, opened her mouth to speak again, but something stopped her. Maybe it was the look in his eyes, or maybe it was the realization that her words hadn't had the effect she was hoping for. Whatever it was, her breath caught in her throat. The words she had been about to unleash seemed to die on her lips, leaving her with nothing but the tension that had built up between them. Still, the moment was far from over. The tension hung heavy, like a storm waiting to break. The room held its breath, waiting for the next move. Would the woman lash out again, or would she take the opportunity to back down? Would the waiter remain silent, or would he speak his truth? The outcome was still unclear, and every second felt like an eternity. But one thing was certain: whatever happened next, it was going to change everything. The silence between them was suffocating, a thick, unspoken challenge hanging in the air. The woman's smugness was beginning to falter, the edges of her certainty blurring as she faced the unwavering calm of the waiter. She shifted in her seat, glancing around the restaurant nervously, as if searching for someone to agree with her, to validate her words. But all she found were eyes that seemed to look away, as if the other diners were too afraid to get caught in her web of entitlement and hatred. The waiter's stillness was like a mirror, reflecting back the ugliness of her actions in a way she hadn't anticipated. She had expected him to squirm, to shrink, to apologize and beg for her forgiveness. But instead, she was the one left unsteady, feeling the walls of her arrogance start to crack. Her words had been weapons, meant to wound, to establish power over someone she saw as inferior. Yet, here she was, suddenly unsure. The waiter, a man she had tried to demean with her venomous speech, had not bowed to her. Instead, he was standing taller than she had ever imagined. The waiter's composure, while admirable, was also a defensive shield against the hurt that she was so recklessly throwing his way. He had learned long ago that silence could be more powerful than any retort. His life hadn't been easy, far from it, but he had never let the cruelties of others define his worth. In his mind, the insults she hurled were not a reflection of who he was, but of who she was. A person so consumed by her own privilege that she couldn't see the humanity standing right in front of her. He had seen people like her before, entitled, dismissive, indifferent to the lives of those around them, as though they existed in a different world entirely. But this time, it was different. He could feel the eyes of the other customers, the tension in the room, and the realization that maybe, just maybe, her words were finally meeting a resistance she hadn't planned on. But then, just as the tension was beginning to feel unbearable, a new voice broke through the silence, a voice that wasn't her own. "Is everything all right here?" The restaurant manager had stepped into the fray, his voice calm yet carrying an air of authority that demanded attention. He stood just a few feet away from the table, his eyes darting between the woman and the waiter, sensing the undercurrent of hostility that had unfolded. The woman, clearly caught off guard, quickly wiped the defensive expression from her face. Yes, everything's fine," she snapped, trying to regain control of the situation. "I just think that certain people shouldn't be in places like this." The manager didn't flinch at her words, but he noticed the waiter's clenched fists, the subtle tension in his posture. He had worked with the waiter for a long time, and knew him well enough to recognize when something was wrong. And right now, something was definitely wrong. With a composed yet firm tone, the manager addressed the woman. "We take matters like this very seriously here. If there's an issue with the service, I'd be happy to address it, but I don't tolerate disrespectful behavior towards our staff." His gaze lingered on the woman, challenging her to respond in a way that wouldn't make things worse. The woman's face flushed red with embarrassment, but her pride, stubborn and unyielding, kept her from backing down entirely. "I'm not disrespecting anyone," she huffed. "I'm just saying the truth." "The truth?" The manager's voice remained even. "Your truth seems to be based on an assumption that isn't grounded in reality. We value every guest who comes here, and we value every member of our team. That's non-negotiable." The woman opened her mouth to argue, but the manager held up his hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "If you're not happy with the service, I can offer to have you leave. But I'd suggest you think carefully before you say anything more." The room was tense now, the confrontation escalating from a simple customer complaint to something much more serious. The other diners had stopped pretending not to notice, some openly staring, others whispering to each other. A few looked at the waiter with sympathy, while others seemed to watch him with an almost reverent respect. It wasn't often that you saw a person maintain their composure in the face of such hatred. It was something people didn't forget. Still, the woman was determined. "I don't know why you're all acting like this is some big deal," she said with an air of superiority, still trying to push the narrative. "I'm just saying what's obvious." The waiter took a deep breath, still standing tall. His mind was racing, but his heart was steady. This was more than just about her words. This was about something far bigger, something that had been brewing in society for years. It wasn't just about a rude customer at a restaurant. It was about the systemic attitudes that people like her held, the belief that they could belittle others without consequence, that they could get away with their prejudices without challenge. He knew it wasn't just this moment that mattered. It was the fact that in that moment, he had the power to show her that the world didn't revolve around her. It was the chance to stand up not just for himself, but for all the people who had been marginalized, ignored, or dismissed by people like her. It was a moment that could echo far beyond the walls of this restaurant. The woman, sensing that the situation was slipping beyond her control, gave one last defiant sneer. "Fine," she said coldly, standing up from her seat. "I don't have time for this." As she turned to leave, she made sure to brush past the waiter with a forceful, almost deliberate nudge, her shoulder knocking against his as if to remind him of his place. But the waiter didn't flinch. He stood his ground, his posture unbroken. The woman walked away in a huff, the sound of her heels echoing against the tile floor, leaving behind an air of discomfort in her wake. The manager watched her go, his expression unreadable, before turning back to the waiter. "Are you all right?" the manager asked, his voice softening. The waiter nodded, though his eyes betrayed the storm still brewing inside. "I'll be fine," he said quietly. But there was something in his voice, a mix of frustration and resolve, that suggested he wasn't just fine. He was changed. The tension in the room didn't dissipate as quickly as the woman's departure. It lingered, thick in the air, as the other diners slowly resumed their meals, their conversations picking back up, but with a different energy now, one that had been shifted by what they had just witnessed. Some were still stealing glances at the waiter, perhaps wondering how someone could remain so calm in the face of such open hostility. Others were probably still reflecting on the woman's words, the ugliness of it, the way she had tried to tear him down. For the waiter, though, the encounter wasn't over. It wasn't just about what had happened in the restaurant, it was about what came after. The truth was, people like the woman didn't go away quietly. They didn't just change. And there was a deep, unsettling feeling in his chest that told him the battle wasn't over. She would remember this moment, but he had a feeling she wouldn't take it lying down. And the consequences of that might be bigger than he realized. The quiet after the woman's departure felt hollow. It was as if the entire room was holding its breath, waiting for the next spark to ignite. The waiter returned to his station, moving with deliberate steps, though his mind was far from the task at hand. His hands still trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the residual energy of the confrontation. He had stood his ground, yes, but something inside him felt unsettled. It wasn't just her words, it was the fact that people like her were everywhere, and her behavior wasn't just an isolated incident. It was part of a larger problem that ran deep in the fabric of society, and that was something he couldn't easily ignore. As he wiped down a nearby table, his thoughts kept drifting back to the woman. The way she had looked at him like he was invisible, unworthy of the same respect she demanded. Her words had been a cruel reminder of how little some people valued others, simply because of their skin, their background, or their circumstances. But even more frustrating was the way she had tried to diminish his humanity, as if he was a servant first, and a person second. But the deeper he thought about it, the more he realized that this moment wasn't just about her, it was about all of them. About him, about the other diners who had stood silent, about the manager who had stepped in at the last moment. Everyone had a role to play in what had just happened, and he couldn't escape the nagging feeling that their collective inaction had only reinforced the very systems that allowed people like her to act the way they did. He took a deep breath and pushed the thoughts aside. Now wasn't the time to unravel all of it. Not yet. The night was still young, and the restaurant wasn't going to run itself. But the weight of the encounter stayed with him, hanging like a dark cloud in the back of his mind. Meanwhile, the woman had left the restaurant, but the events of the evening hadn't ended for her either. She stormed out of the front doors, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. The evening air hit her face, cold and biting, but she barely noticed it. Her mind was consumed with a mixture of anger and disbelief. How had it all gone wrong? She was used to getting what she wanted, used to having people apologize to her, not the other way around. The waiter had dared to stand up to her, and the manager had humiliated her by taking his side. For the first time in a long while, she felt small, insignificant. But she wasn't going to let it end like that. She reached into her purse and pulled out her phone, dialing the number of a friend. She needed someone to talk to, someone who would understand. The phone rang for a moment before it was picked up. "What's up?" Her friend's voice came through the line, casual and indifferent. "I can't believe this," she muttered, her voice laced with frustration. "I went to that restaurant, and the waiter, he was so rude. And then the manager. They all turned on me like I was in the wrong. It was outrageous." Her friend paused. "Wait, what happened?" "He was just awful," she continued, her anger rising again as she recounted the entire incident. "He couldn't even be bothered to do his job right, and when I said something, he had the nerve to look at me like I was crazy. And the manager. He practically threw me out. It's like no one has any respect for people who are actually important." Her friend's voice softened, a note of caution creeping in. "I mean, I get that it was a bad situation, but maybe you should think about what you said. People don't just get upset for no reason." The woman's anger flared again, and she snapped back, "I don't need a lecture right now. They crossed the line, and I'm not going to let them get away with it. I'll make sure they pay for this. I know people. I'll make sure everyone knows what happened." As she hung up the phone, a plan began to form in her mind. She wasn't going to let this go. She was going to take action. It wasn't about the waiter anymore, it was about sending a message. The world needed to know that people like her had power, and no one could challenge that. She would make sure this incident was blown out of proportion. It was a matter of pride now. Back at the restaurant, the evening continued. The waiter tried to shake off the lingering unease, focusing on his tasks as the dinner crowd thinned out. But he couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened. It wasn't just the words the woman had said, it was the knowledge that people like her existed in the world, people who would go to great lengths to maintain their sense of superiority. The encounter had stirred something in him, a feeling he couldn't easily dismiss. He had been in situations before, where people judged him, assumed things about him based on nothing more than his appearance. But this time, it had felt different. This time, there had been an opportunity to stand up, to push back, to make a statement. Still, the incident was far from over. The woman's words had gotten under his skin in a way he hadn't anticipated, and he couldn't help but wonder if there would be repercussions. He knew how these things worked. People like her didn't just let things slide, they retaliated. And in his line of work, retaliation didn't always come in the form of a confrontation. It could be more subtle, more insidious. A bad review, a complaint to the manager, anything that could cause trouble. As the last customers finished their meals and the staff began to close up, the waiter exchanged a few quiet words with the manager, who gave him an understanding nod. "You handled it well," the manager said, his voice low. "I don't want you to worry. If she says anything, we've got your back." But the waiter wasn't reassured. He knew that backing him up now wasn't enough. He needed more than just support from his coworkers. He needed change, real change. And that was something much harder to come by. The night seemed to stretch on longer than it should have, the weight of the day's events lingering in the quiet corners of the restaurant. The waiter finally gathered his things and clocked out, stepping into the cool night air. But as he made his way down the street, the feeling of unease only grew. What if the woman had already started her campaign? What if she was already gathering people to back her up? What if his job, his reputation, everything he had worked for was at risk? He didn't know what the next day would bring, but one thing was clear: this wasn't over. The conflict between him and the woman had only just begun. And the storm that was brewing had the potential to change everything. The days after the incident felt like a slow burn. The waiter couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something he couldn't control. Every time the phone rang at work, his heart skipped a beat. Every time a new customer walked in, he wondered if it was someone connected to her, someone who had heard the twisted version of the story she had surely told. He couldn't stop playing out the possibilities in his head: a bad review, a social media post, even worse, an email to corporate. He had seen it happen before. People with power didn't like being confronted, didn't like being shown up. They lashed out, and when they did, they were ruthless. The woman, meanwhile, was making her move. It started small, just a post on her social media page. A few words, a simple story about how she had been mistreated by a rude waiter at a high-end restaurant. But she didn't stop there. She tagged the restaurant's official page, added a few hashtags, and sent it out to all her followers. It was just the beginning, but she knew it would grow. People would rally to her cause, and in the process, she would gain support, sympathy. She was playing the victim, and she was good at it. Her followers, many of whom had never set foot in the restaurant, took the bait without question. The comment section exploded with anger, with calls for boycotts and demands for the waiter's firing. By the next day, the restaurant's phone lines were flooded with complaints. Customers threatened not to return. Some even went as far as to call the waiter's actions racist and demanded answers. The restaurant, unsure of how to handle the growing pressure, found itself caught between a rock and a hard place. They couldn't afford to lose their reputation, but at the same time, they didn't want to throw one of their own under the bus without fully understanding what had really happened. The manager, still standing by the waiter, called him in for a private meeting. "Look, I know what you're going through," he began, his voice low, as if trying to calm the storm brewing in the air. "But this is getting out of hand. The woman's post is going viral, and people are starting to take sides. We're getting calls from all directions. Corporate's going to want an answer soon." The waiter listened in silence, his fists clenched on the table. He knew it was coming. The pressure, the expectations, the way everything was being twisted. "I didn't do anything wrong," he said, the words heavy with frustration. "I know you didn't," the manager reassured him. "But we need to figure out how to handle this before it gets worse. I've got your back, but you need to keep a cool head." The waiter nodded, but inside, his mind was racing. The calm, professional attitude he'd worked so hard to maintain now felt like a fragile mask. It wasn't just about the woman anymore. It was about the system. The people who would side with her without knowing the truth, the ones who would turn a blind eye to the real issue at hand. He had never been afraid of confrontation, but this was different. This wasn't just a personal battle. This was something bigger. At the same time, the woman was basking in her newfound power. She reveled in the attention her post had garnered, the way people rallied behind her without question. Every like, every comment, every share felt like validation, like a confirmation that she was in the right. It didn't matter if the story wasn't entirely true, people believed her, and that was all that mattered. She had made a name for herself, painted herself as a victim, and now, it was her turn to make the world bend to her will. But as the days wore on, the tension between the woman and the waiter continued to escalate. The story had gone beyond social media and started to seep into the local news. Journalists were picking up on the story, and it wasn't long before it became a full-blown controversy. News outlets, eager to cover a juicy story, started calling the restaurant. The debate raged online. Was this a case of a server who overstepped, or was it an unfortunate misunderstanding? And more importantly, how much did the waiter's race factor into the situation? Was this a matter of poor customer service, or something more sinister? The conflict was being dissected from every angle, the tension mounting with every passing hour. The waiter could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had tried to stay out of the spotlight, to keep his head down, but now it was impossible. Everywhere he went, people whispered. Some were sympathetic, others judgmental, all of them uncertain about what had really happened. The woman's version of the story had taken on a life of its own, and now he was fighting not just for his job, but for his dignity, his very sense of self. Then, just when things seemed like they couldn't get worse, the restaurant was hit with a bombshell. The woman had filed an official complaint with corporate, accusing the waiter of discrimination and harassment. She demanded that he be fired immediately, and she threatened to sue for damages. The complaint was detailed, full of exaggerated claims, twisted facts, and selective memories. It was clear she had thought this through, crafting her narrative carefully to leave no room for doubt. The waiter's heart sank when he heard the news. He knew the restaurant would have no choice but to act, and the thought of losing everything, his job, his reputation, his peace of mind, was almost too much to bear. But what struck him the most was the realization that the woman had been preparing for this moment all along. She had been playing the long game, manipulating the situation from the start, and now she was ready to push it to its final conclusion. The manager, visibly shaken by the weight of the complaint, called the waiter into his office once again. "I've got bad news," he said, his voice strained. "Corporate's reviewing everything. They want us to put you on temporary leave while they investigate." The waiter's breath caught in his throat. Temporary leave. He had been suspended before, but this was different. It wasn't just a simple reprimand. This was serious. His mind spun as he tried to make sense of it. How had things escalated so quickly? How had a simple disagreement become a full-blown crisis? The tension between the two sides, between the woman's relentless pursuit of revenge and the waiter's fight to protect his integrity, was reaching a breaking point. The social media war, the corporate investigation, the mounting pressure, it was all coming to a head. And now, with both sides unwilling to back down, something had to give. But what would that be? The waiter couldn't help but wonder if he had the strength to survive this battle. He knew the stakes were high, but how much further could this go before it reached its explosive climax? The tension in the restaurant was palpable, a quiet storm that no one knew how to calm. As the days dragged on, the waiter's life seemed to spin further out of control. Every call from the manager, every email from corporate, felt like another weight pressing down on him. The woman's complaint had stirred the pot in a way he hadn't anticipated. And now, with the official investigation underway, he found himself in an even more precarious position. The question wasn't just about his job anymore, it was about his future. His reputation had been tarnished, and the constant barrage of negative comments online only made it worse. He couldn't even go to the grocery store without seeing the headline about the racist waiter plastered across his news feed. But just as he was starting to feel like the world was closing in on him, something unexpected happened. A message popped up on his phone, a simple notification that changed everything. The woman, still riding high on her newfound power, had shared a new post this time. It wasn't just a complaint about the waiter. It was a full-on video, one that she claimed showed the entire incident from a different perspective. The post quickly gained traction, and before he could even process what was happening, the video went viral. At first glance, the footage seemed innocuous, just a shaky phone recording of the scene in the restaurant. But the more the waiter watched, the more his stomach churned. The video had been edited. Parts had been cut, moments twisted. It was a carefully constructed version of the truth, one that painted him in the worst possible light. The footage made it look like he had been condescending, dismissive, and worst of all, hostile. There were even moments where he seemed to raise his voice, though in the actual encounter, he had remained calm. The woman's version of the story had now taken on a completely different angle. It was no longer just about a rude waiter, it was about a racist incident, one that painted him as a villain in a much larger narrative. The waiter's heart sank as he watched the video over and over again, his pulse quickening with every distorted frame. This wasn't just a complaint anymore. This was a full-blown attack on his character. The stakes had just been raised in a way he couldn't ignore. The woman had crossed a line, and now he was in a fight that could cost him everything. His job, his dignity, even his sense of self, everything was hanging in the balance. He knew the restaurant would have to react. With the videos circulating, the public perception of the situation was no longer just a matter of differing opinions, it was a media frenzy. People on social media, both strangers and even some of his former regulars, were already calling for him to be fired. The comments were vicious, accusing him of everything from blatant racism to verbal abuse. He had never felt so exposed, so powerless. His world was crumbling before his eyes, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. But as the initial shock began to wear off, a new wave of doubt began to creep in. Something didn't feel right. The video was too polished, too purposeful. It was clear that it had been carefully edited to tell a story, but whose story? Who had filmed it? Who had orchestrated this? His suspicion grew when he saw something else that sent a chill down his spine, a comment on the post from a familiar face. It was from the manager of the restaurant, a simple line that read, "I wasn't aware of this angle until today, but I support you, always." The words were supportive on the surface, but something about the timing made him uneasy. Why hadn't the manager mentioned this video before? Why had he waited until now to comment publicly? Had he known it was coming? The waiter's mind raced as he pieced together the possibilities. Was the manager involved? Had he seen the video before it went viral? Or had he somehow been manipulated into backing the woman's side? It wasn't just the manager's strange timing that was unsettling, it was the feeling that there were forces at play here that he didn't fully understand. The woman was clearly playing a strategic game, manipulating the situation at every turn. But was she acting alone? Suddenly, the waiter's phone buzzed again. It was a text from an unknown number. Hesitant, he opened it. The message was short and to the point. "I know who filmed it." Meet me tonight at the old diner on 5th. You'll want to hear what I have to say. The waiter's mind raced. Who could this be? And why now? A million questions swirled in his head, but one thing was clear: this was his chance to find out the truth. It could be a trap, or it could be the break he needed. Either way, he knew he couldn't ignore it. His only hope of clearing his name, of getting out from under the suffocating weight of the lies, was to find out what was really going on. The night felt colder as he made his way to the diner, his steps quick and deliberate. The city was unusually quiet, as if it, too, was waiting for something to happen. When he reached the diner, he hesitated for a moment before pushing open the door. The low hum of the neon lights buzzed above him as he stepped inside, his eyes scanning the empty booths. It was nearly closing time, and the place was nearly deserted. He spotted a figure sitting in the corner booth, someone he didn't recognize, but who looked as though they were waiting for him. He approached cautiously, every nerve on edge. The person looked up as he drew near, and without a word, slid a small envelope across the table. "This is all the proof you need," the stranger said in a voice that was low but firm. "Everything you've been wondering about, it's all in there." The waiter's heart raced as he took the envelope, his mind spinning with questions. Who was this person? Why were they helping him? And what exactly was inside the envelope? He didn't have time to open it then. The weight of the moment, the unknown surrounding him, was too much to ignore. But as he stood up to leave, a single thought echoed in his mind: was this the break he'd been waiting for, or was it yet another piece of the puzzle that would lead him down a dangerous path? The tension, already thick in the air, was now about to explode into something much bigger than he could have ever anticipated. And with it, his fight to clear his name would only grow more intense. The envelope felt heavy in his hands as the waiter stood up, heart racing, every step he took toward the door feeling like it might be his last chance to understand everything that had led to this moment. The strange figure in the booth didn't follow him, didn't say another word. Just as the waiter reached the door, he glanced back one last time. The person was already looking down, as if disappearing into the shadows, their role in the story done. Outside, the city felt strangely quiet, as if the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for him to make the next move. He didn't even realize he'd walked all the way to his car until he stood next to it, staring at the envelope still clutched in his hand. The wind picked up, but the air felt still. He didn't want to open it here, out in the open where someone might see. So, he slid into the car, locking the door behind him, and immediately tore open the envelope. Inside, there were a few photos and a small note. The photos were all of the woman, taken from various angles, each one showing her interacting with someone he hadn't expected: his manager. The images were clear, taken with a sharp focus, capturing private moments in the restaurant, moments that told a much different story than the one the woman had portrayed online. The photos showed her arriving early, meeting with the manager in the back office, whispering to him in hushed tones, and leaving the restaurant shortly after the incident with the waiter. The note, written in neat handwriting, simply read, "She's been manipulating this whole thing from the start. The truth is, she wanted him gone before you even walked up to her table." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. The woman hadn't just been playing the victim, she had been orchestrating the entire situation, and she hadn't acted alone. The manager, the person he had trusted to protect him, had been complicit in it all. He felt sick to his stomach. The truth was more complicated than he could have ever imagined. His mind raced. The manager had known about the incident, knew it was going to happen, and still chose to let it unfold the way it did. And now, with everything the woman had posted, with the video and the complaint, it was clear they'd set him up. The woman's accusations, her twisted version of events, none of it had been an accident. It was a well-crafted plan to destroy his life. But why? He sat in his car for a long time, trying to piece everything together. The manager had been working with the woman, But why? Was it about money? Was it revenge for something that had happened in the past? He couldn't make sense of it. His heart pounded in his chest. The realization of what had happened, how much he had been betrayed, was almost too much to bear. But the pieces started falling into place when he thought about it more carefully. The manager's strange behavior, the odd timing of the video's release, the way everything seemed to spiral so quickly. It wasn't just about him. It was about the restaurant itself. There was a bigger game being played here, one that involved power, control, and money. The woman, the manager, they were using him as a pawn in something far darker than a simple confrontation between customer and server. They were working together to take down the restaurant, to make it vulnerable, to break it apart from the inside. The waiter suddenly understood that he wasn't just fighting for his job, he was fighting for the very integrity of the restaurant he had worked at for years. They'd planned to ruin it, to get rid of anyone who might stand in their way. With a heavy heart, he decided what he had to do next. He couldn't just walk away. Not now. Not with everything on the line. The next morning, he returned to the restaurant, walking in through the back door, his mind set on one thing: confronting the manager. There was no turning back now. As he walked into the kitchen, he could feel the weight of the atmosphere, the silence hanging thick in the air as the staff worked quietly, avoiding eye contact. They all knew something was off, even if they didn't know exactly what had happened. The manager wasn't in the kitchen, so he went straight to his office. He knocked once, twice. There was no answer. The door was slightly ajar. He pushed it open and stepped inside. The manager looked up, startled, then quickly composed himself, flashing a forced smile. "You're here early," he said, his voice strained. "I know what you've been doing," the waiter said, his voice steady but full of cold anger. "I know about you and her. The video. The setup. Everything." The manager's face turned pale, and for a moment, there was no sound. The tension in the room thickened, the weight of the truth crashing down on both of them. For a long moment neither spoke. "I didn't have a choice," the manager said, his voice low, almost pleading. "She had dirt on me. She was going to take me down if I didn't help her. You don't understand, there's too much at stake here." "Too much at stake?" the waiter repeated, his voice rising with disbelief. "You put my life at risk, my career, everything I've worked for what? To save yourself?" The manager's eyes darted around the room, as though looking for a way out. But there was no escape now. The waiter had the proof. The photos, the note, the truth was out there. And the manager knew it. "It was never supposed to go this far," the manager whispered, almost as if talking to himself. "I thought I could control it, keep it under wraps. But once she went public with the video, it was too late. She's already won." The waiter's mind reeled. The realization hit him hard. This wasn't just about his job. This was about the very survival of the restaurant. The manager had chosen to sacrifice him in order to protect his own interests, and now the woman was holding all the cards. But just as the tension reached its breaking point, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. A familiar voice, called out from the door. "Is everything okay in here?" It was another employee, someone who had been with the restaurant for years. And the look on their face was one of shock, confusion, and something else. Something that made the waiter freeze. "You should have known," the employee said, stepping forward. "You were always the last to see it." The manager, the woman? They weren't the only ones behind all this. I was, too. The room felt like it was closing in. Another twist. Another betrayal. Just when he thought he understood it all, the final piece of the puzzle shifted. The enemy wasn't just one or two people, it was a network of lies and manipulation, reaching farther than he could have imagined. And in that moment, as the weight of it all sank in, he realized this was just the beginning. The fight was far from over. The room fell silent as the employee's words lingered in the air, heavy and full of meaning. The waiter stood frozen, unable to process what he had just heard. This employee had been involved too? He thought he had seen all the pieces of the puzzle, thought he understood the game that had been played. But now, with this final revelation, it felt like the ground beneath him was shifting, and he was losing his footing. The manager, the woman, the people in power, they weren't just fighting him, they were all part of a larger scheme, a network of manipulation that had been built over time. The employee stepped forward, their eyes flickering with something that looked almost like regret. "I didn't want to be part of it," they said, their voice low and hesitant. "But you have to understand, they had leverage. They had something on me. If I didn't help, I'd lose everything." "Everything?" the waiter asked, his voice thick with disbelief. "What, like me? Like my life? My career?" The employee nodded slowly. "It wasn't supposed to go this far. None of it. But once they started pulling the strings, I couldn't stop it. I'm sorry." The words cut through him like a knife. Betrayal. It had come from every direction. The restaurant, once a place of comfort and routine, had become a battlefield. And now, it seemed there was no one left to trust. The waiter looked around the room, feeling the walls close in around him. He had thought he was fighting for his job, but now it was clear he was fighting for much more: his dignity, his sense of self, and his place in a world that had suddenly turned upside down. For a moment, all he could hear was the sound of his own breathing, steady but filled with the weight of everything that had just been revealed. The manager, the woman, and now this employee, they had all played their parts, but who was behind it all? Who had orchestrated this massive web of deceit? Was it just about money and power, or was there something deeper at play? His mind raced as he tried to make sense of it. The employee stood there, waiting for him to speak, to say something, but the waiter couldn't bring himself to respond. The truth was too much to process, too much to bear in one sitting. "I know this is a lot to take in," the employee said, breaking the silence. "But you have to believe me, I didn't want to hurt you. I never wanted this." The waiter stared at them, trying to read their expression, but it was hard to tell what was genuine anymore. Was this person really apologetic, or were they just trying to save themselves? He couldn't tell. Suddenly, the door swung open, and the manager entered the room, his face tight, his eyes darting between the waiter and the employee. There was no longer any pretense of friendliness. The game was up. The waiter knew it, the employee knew it, and the manager knew it. They were all trapped in the same tangled web, and now it was time for everything to come to a head. "You should have stayed out of it," the manager said, his voice cold and unforgiving. "Now look where we are. You've ruined everything." The employee flinched but didn't say anything. The waiter, however, stepped forward, his chest tight with anger. "No, you ruined everything," he said, his voice steady but forceful. "You used me. You used all of us." "And for what?" "To protect your own interests? To tear everything down just to save your own skin?" The manager's eyes narrowed. "You don't understand," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "This place was sinking. It was only a matter of time before it went under. I did what I had to do to stay afloat. If that meant sacrificing you, then so be it. I couldn't afford to lose my position." The waiter shook his head in disbelief. "And you thought ruining someone else's life was worth it? You thought tearing apart everything I've worked for was justified?" The manager didn't answer. Instead, he looked away, unable to meet the waiter's eyes. The silence between them was thick with unspoken truths, truths that neither of them wanted to face. In that moment, the waiter realized something: it wasn't just about him. It was about all of them, the employees, the managers, the customers. They had all been caught in the same broken system, a system where power and money had clouded everything else. It wasn't just one person's fault, it was a failure of the entire system. The waiter's heart pounded as he turned to face the employee. "You didn't have to be part of this," he said softly. "You didn't have to go along with it." The employee's face softened, and for the first time, the waiter saw a flicker of genuine regret. "I know. I didn't want to, but I felt trapped. It's hard to explain." The tension in the room was palpable. The manager was still standing there, watching them both, his eyes dark with something the waiter couldn't quite place. It was almost as if the manager had given up on trying to hide the truth. "You know what the worst part is?" the waiter said, his voice cutting through the air. "You made me feel like I was the one who was wrong. Like I was the one who had to fix something, when really, it was you all along." The manager didn't respond. The employee shifted uncomfortably, unsure of what to say next. But the waiter wasn't finished. "I'm done," he said, his voice firm. "I'm done playing your game. I'm done being your pawn." For a moment, the room was silent. Then, the waiter walked toward the door, his footsteps steady, each one echoing in the space that had once felt like home. He wasn't sure what the future held, whether he would be able to rebuild, whether he could find peace after everything that had happened, but he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to let them destroy him. Not now, not ever. As he stepped out of the room, he caught one last glimpse of the manager and the employee. The weight of the situation hung heavy in the air, but the waiter didn't turn back. He had made his decision. It was time to move on. Outside, the sun was just beginning to set, casting a warm glow over the city. The streets were alive with people, moving in every direction, unaware of the battle that had just unfolded inside the restaurant. The waiter stood for a moment, taking a deep breath, letting the cool air fill his lungs. He wasn't sure what the next step would be, but for the first time in what felt like forever, he felt a sense of clarity. He wasn't just fighting for his job anymore. He was fighting for himself. And no matter what happened next, he was going to win. The story of the racist confrontation, the manipulation, the lies, it was far from over. The battle had been won, but the war was just beginning. The waiter knew that. But for now, as the sun dipped below the horizon, he allowed himself a moment of peace, a moment to reflect on everything that had led him here. And in that moment, he realized that the most important thing he had was his own integrity. That, above all else, was something no one could ever take away from him.